Greetings to all. I'm Kavita, Head Department of English, Madurai Sivagasi Nodas Pioneer Meenakshi Women's College, Puvandi. In this video, we are going to see a fiction Jane Eyre written by Charlotte Bronte. This video covers an author introduction of the novel, characters list, summary, and theme. Let us see the author introduction. Charlotte was born on 21 April 1816, the third of six children of Patrick Bronte. Patrick was an Irish Crofler's son who rose via a Cambridge education to become in 1820 a perpetual curate at Haworth in Berkshire. Charlotte was only 5 in 1821 when her mother Maria died. 4 years later, her two older sisters died as a result of her horse condition in the clergy daughter's school at Cowan's Bridge. After the death of her two oldest Bronte's daughters, Patrick and Maria's sisters, Elizabeth gave the children a stimulating and wide-ranging education at home. Charlotte, her two younger sisters Annie and Emily Bronte, and their brilliant, unstable brother Branwell invented complex imaginary world which they wrote about extensively in tiny homemade books. A fruitful literary apprenticeship, aged 15, Charlotte enrolled at a new school not far from Haworth. Row Head School was less harsh than the clergy daughter's school, but Charlotte spent only 18 months there before returning home. As an adult, Charlotte worked as a governess and spent some years teaching at a boarding school in Brussels. Her requited love for the school's headmaster informed her novels, Willet, and professors. It was the passion and rebellion of Jane Eyre that earned her fame, and when visiting London, she moved in the best literary circles, befriended by Mrs. Gaskell and Thackeray. The latter remembered the trembling little frame, the little hand, the great honest eyes, surely written during and after the tragic death of her three siblings within a single year, displayed Charlotte's engagement with both women's rights and radical workers' movements. In June 1854, she married her father's curate Arthur Nichols, who had long been a loyal suitor. She became pregnant but severely weakened by morning sickness, died at the age of 38 on 31 March 1855. Let us see the introduction of the novel. Jane Eyre, originally published as Jane Eyre, an autobiography, is a novel by English writer Charlotte Bronte. It was published under her pen name Currer Bell on 19th October 1847 by Smith, Elder and Co. of London. The first American edition was published the following year by Harper and Brothers of New York. Jane Eyre is an experience of its eponymous heroine, including her growth to adulthood and her love for Mr. Rochester, the brooding master of Thornfield Hall. The novel revolutionized prose fiction by being the first to focus on its protagonist's moral and spiritual development through an intimate first-person narrative where actions and events are colored by a psychological intensity. Charlotte Bronte has been called the first historian of the private consciousness and the literary ancestor of writers like Marcel Proust and James Joyce. So let us see the characters of the novel. Jane Eyre, the orphaned protagonist of the story. When the novel begins, she is an isolated, powerless 10 years old living with an aunt and a cousin who dislikes her. Next character, Edward Fairfax Rochester. So he is Jane's lover, a dark, passionate, brooding man, a traditional romantic hero. Rochester has lived a troubled wife. Next character, Sarah Reed, Jane's unpleasant aunt who raises her till she is 10 years old. Despite Jane's attempts at reconciliation before her aunt's death, Her aunt refuses to relent. She dies unloved by her children and unrepentant of her mistreatment of Jane. John Reed, Jane's nasty and spoiled cousin, responsible for Jane's banishment to the Red Room. Addicted to drinking and gambling, John supposedly commits suicide at the age of 23 when his mother is no longer willing or able to pay his debts. Next character is Eliza Reed, another one of Jane's spoiled cousins. Eliza is insanely jealous of the beauty of her sister Georgiana. Georgiana reads Eliza's and John's sister. Georgiana is the beauty of the family. She also shallow and self-centered, interested primarily in her own pleasure. The next character is Bessie Lee, the maid at Cat's Head, who sometimes consoles Jane by telling her entertaining stories and singing her songs. Bessie visits Jane at Lowood, impressed by Jane's intellectual attainments and ladylike behavior. Bessie marries the coachman Robert Levin and has 3 children. So let us see the other character, Mr. Lloyd, the kind apothecary who suggests that Jane be sent to school following her horrifying experience in the Red Room. His letter to Miss Temple clears Jane of the accusation Mrs. Reed has made against her. The next character is Mr. Brooklehurst, the stingy, mean-hearted manager of Lowood. He hypocritically feeds the girls at the school starvation level ration, while his wife and daughters live luxuriously. The next character is Helen Burns, Jane's spiritual and intellectual friend at Lowood. Although she is unfairly punished by Miss Scatcherd at Lowood, Helen maintains her pious partially through her loving friendship with Miss Temple. Maria Temple, the warm-hearted superintendent at Lowood, who generously offers the girls bread and cheese when their breakfast are inedible. An impressive scholar, a model of ladylike behavior, and a compassionate person, Miss Temple is a positive role model for Jane. The next character is Miss Miller, teacher for the youngest students at Lowood, who greets Jane at first in the school. Miss Catchcard, the history and grammar teacher at Lowood, she constantly humiliates and punishes Helen Burns. Miss Smith, a red-cheeked teacher at Lowood, who is in charge of sewing instruction. Madame Pierrette, the likable French teacher at Lowood, who comes from Lisieux, France. So the next character that we are going to see, Blanche Ingram, the beautiful and haughty society woman Rochester pretends to love. Her comments about the inspiness of governesses show the lack of respect that most governesses faced in the wealthy Victorian families where they worked. Next character, Adele Warren, Jane's pupil at Thornfield, whose foreignness, like her mother's, reveals many of Jane's Anglo-centric prejudice. The next character is Celine Warren, once Rochester's mistress. This Parisian opera dancer used Rochester for his money, although she actually despised him. Rochester discovers her true feelings when he overhears a conversation between her and one of her other lovers. Next character is Richard Dick Mason. He is Bertha's brother, a weak-willed man. During his visit to Thornfield, he is beaten and stabbed by Bertha when he goes up to her room alone. So the next character is Bertha Mason Rochester. So she is Rochester's wife, the Gracie women in the attic. A Creole woman from Spanish town Jamaica, Bertha was betrothed to Rochester by the arrangements of their father, who planned to consolidate their wealth. Next character is Grace Poole, Bertha's keeper at Thornfield, who has a predilection for gin. Grace is initially accused of perpetrating all of Bertha's sins in the household. The next character is St. John River, Jane's cousin. St. John is a cold, despotic, excessively zealous. Unhappy with his humble position as the minister at Morton, St. John wants to become a missionary in order to meet his ambitions for power and glory. The next character is Diana and Mary Rivers, St. John's sisters and Jane's cousins. Diana and Mary are exemplars of accomplished, benevolent, and intellectual women. Working as governors, they show the way intelligent, well bred women are degraded by their position in wealthy families. Next character is Mr. Briggs, John Eyre's attorney. Briggs prevents Jane's bigamous marriage to Rochester and searches for her following her uncle's death so she can claim her inheritance. Then John Eyre, Jane's and the River's uncle. John Eyre makes a fortune as a wine merchant in Madeira. Although he plans to adopt Jane, he dies before they ever meet, but leave his entire fortune, 20 pounds, to her. He quarreled with Mr. Rivers and therefore didn't leave his money to the Rivers children. So at last, the elderly servants who care for Rochester at Ferdinand after Thornfield is destroyed by the fire. So let us see the summary of the novel. Jane Eyre actually is divided into 38 chapters. It was originally published in 3 volumes in the 19th century, comprising chapters 1 to 15, 16 to 27, and 28 to 38. The second edition was dedicated to William Makepeace Thackeray. The novel is a first-person narrative from the perspective of the title character. Its setting is somewhere in the north of England, late in the reign of George III. Jane Eyre is an orphan girl living with her aunt Mrs. Reed at Catescott Hall. Mrs. Reed and her children treat Jane cruelly and look down on her as a dependent, punishing her for a fight with her cousin that she didn't start. Mrs. Reed locks her in a red room where Jane's uncle, Mr. Reed, had died years before. His ghostly presence terrifies Jane. Soon after, Mrs. Reed sends Jane to the Lowood Institutions, a charity school run by hypocritical Mr. Brooklehurst. Lowood has terrible condition and a harsh work ethic, though the compassionate supervisor Maria Temple intervenes sometimes to give the girls a break. At Lowood, Jane makes friends with another student, Helen Burns, who helps Jane learn to endure personal injustice and believe in a benevolent God. Helen, however, is sick with consumption and dies. When a typhus epidemic decimates the school students' population, new management takes over and improves Lowood conditions. Jane flourishes under her newly considerate teachers and after 6 years becomes a teacher herself. Miss Temple marries and leaves Lowood, and the 18-year-old Jane advertises for a job as a private tutor. She is hired to become the governess of the young Adele Warrens. Adele is the ward of Mr. Rochester, the older, swarthy, and commanding master of Thornfield Hall. While in residence at Thornfield, Jane frequently hears strange laughter and one night rescues Mr. Rochester from a fire in his bedroom. On another occasion, Jane helps Mr. Rochester secretly bandage and send away a man named Mr. Mason who was slashed and beaten on the 3rd floor of the mansion. Rochester blames a quickly servant, Grace Poole, but Jane is skeptical. Mr. Rochester brings a party of English aristocrats to Thornfield, including the beautiful but calculating Blanche Ingram. She aims to marry him, but Mr. Rochester turns Blanche away as he is increasingly drawn toward the plain but clever and direct Jane. Mr. Rochester soon asks Jane to marry him. Jane, who has gradually fallen in love with Rochester, accepts. Rochester hastily prepares the wedding, but during the small ceremony, a London lawyer intervenes and declares that Mr. Rochester already has a wife, Bertha Mason, from the West Indies. Her brother, Mr. Mason, appears in confirm this. Mr. Rochester reluctantly admits to it, and takes everyone to the third floor, where Bertha is revealed as a raving lunatic looked after by Grace. Rochester was tricked into their marriage, and he appeals to Jane to come away with him anyway, but Jane refuses to be his mistress. After a dream that wants her to flee temptation, Jane sneaks away from Thornfield Dawn. Penniless in a region of England she does not know, Jane experiences 3 bitter days of begging, sleeping outside, and nearly starving. Eventually, she comes upon and is taken in at Moor House, the home of Mary, Diana, and St. John Rivers, a stained local clergyman. St. John gives Jane a position teaching in a rural school. Jane discovers that an uncle she is never met has died and left over £20,000. That uncle turns out to be related to the Rivers siblings, so John suddenly has cousins. In her joy at finding family, she divides her fortune equally between them. St. John has plans to go to India as a missionary, and he proposes marriage to Jane so she'll accompany and work for him. Jane feels familial affection but to love for St. John. She says she would go as St. John's sister, but he will accept no condition. St. John's forceful personality almost convinces John Jane to sacrifice herself and marry him, but in her confused emotional state, Jane experiences a telepathic flash. She hears Rochester's voice calling to her. She immediately leaves to seek out Rochester. Jane finds Thornfield Hall destroyed from a fire, and Bertha had sat in Jane's old bedroom. During the blast, Bertha had jumped from the roof and died. Rochester saved his servants but suffered injuries that left him blind and missing a hand. Jane meets the humbled Rochesters at Ferdinand, his woodland retreat, and promises always to take care of him. They marry, bring back Adela from boarding school, and have a son. Rochester eventually regains sight in one eye. So this is what the story is ending very happily. So actually the novels focuses on the themes like love versus autonomy, religion, social class, gender relations, home and belonging, anxiety and uncertainty, and self-discovery. So these are the main themes that has focused on this novel. So thank you for patient listening. Thank you all.